Another massive issue out there, tariffs. I want to address Supreme Court justices directly. I spent a lot of time listening to the oral argument, and I was appalled. I was appalled at the justices. Now, not a single justice has ever been a business person. None of them. We're talking about commerce here, right? There's 9 lawyers on the Supreme Court. All lawyers. They've worked at law firms. They've been professors. They've been lower court judges. Some of them have worked in the Reagan administration. Some of them worked in the Obama administration, whatever. But by experience, they have no relevant experience. That by itself is not intellectually disqualifying, but it became apparent to me as I was watching the nature of the questions that were asked of the Solicitor General of the United States, that most of these justices don't have a clue. Again, they're lawyers who have been lawyers their whole life, which is fine. I thought most of the questions were intellectually lazy, if not embarrassing, and mostly political, ideological, and even sophomoric. Now, let me be specific. Let's start with Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts. He insisted again and again that the tariff is a tax, pure and simple. It's a tax, and that only Congress has the power to tax. The president does not, and that's that. Well, of course he's right that the Constitution grants Congress the power over the purse under Article 1, including taxation. But the purpose of a tariff is less about taxing the citizens and more about conducting international affairs, economic, diplomatic, and national security. Just last week, the president's use of a 100% additional tariff on Communist China, responding to Communist China's massive tariff on rare earth minerals that we need for our military systems, our missiles, that we need for our computers, that we need for 1,000 other uses relating to our economy and our security needs in this country. So is that tariff a tax? Certainly it wasn't a tax. To say a tariff is a tax, and that's that, Mr. Chief Justice, is ludicrous. In fact, a tariff issued on foreign products by our government is not a direct tax on our citizens. The argument goes that it increases the price of goods and services when foreign products are imported into our country. Therefore, it's a tax or an indirect tax. So it's not an actual tax, if we want to be exquisitely clear with our language. And while it may lead to an increase in the price of a product, it may not in the price of another product, as we have actually seen over the last 8 months. So this isn't theoretical. We see it. Some products increase in price. Some products don't. The President of the United States negotiates and he warns the country, we're increasing our tariff because your tariff's high, but you better not increase our prices. It's a give and take, and that's a constant. But to say that it's a tax in the context of what the framers of the Constitution had in mind under Article 1 and the power of the purse is simply not correct. But I have another reason to respond to Justice Roberts. Justice Roberts, you said a tariff is a tax and the president does not have the power to raise taxes. Yet when it comes to executive branch regulations, virtually all of which drive up costs to domestic producers and consumers and are not passed by Congress, nor do they reach the level of a presidential signature, but are issued by the bureaucracy, why is that not an unconstitutional tax levied by the executive branch in violation of separation of powers? In other words, you have the EPA, you have the Agriculture Department. They exist to issue regulations. And they have issued over the course of decades hundreds of thousands of regulations, filling millions of pages of the Federal Register, controlling what you do, what you can't do, your expenses, the supply chain, on and on and on. So if Justice Roberts, the Chief Justice, is concerned about a tariff being a tax, well, then why isn't he ruling and arguing that regulations are taxes, that regulations by their very nature are unconstitutional because they're coming out of the bureaucracy, not even the president, but under the umbrella of the executive branch, and therefore that violates separation of powers and the power of the purse? Has anybody heard him argue that? I have not. Doesn't that violate separation of powers? Let's go to Justice Barrett. In part, she seemed obsessed with precedent, judicial precedent, and spent a lot of her time at oral argument focused on the fact there's no judicial precedent for the proposition that a president has so much discretion in levying tariffs. I can't find any case that rules that he does. Where's the case, she kept asking. The Solicitor General pointed to a lower court ruling, which she found unpersuasive, yet a relentless focus on this was very odd to me. The fact is, Justice Barrett, there is no precedent, and that proves nothing. For example, there's no precedent that cuts the other way either. That is, there's no precedent that a president cannot exercise the kind of tariff authority that President Trump is exercising. Where's the case for that? Other than the one that's on appeal, where's the case for that? In fact, at one point, Barrett read language in the relevant statute, which she claimed was not ambiguous. The language is clear, it's robust, and limited the president's tariff authority. That's the intent, she said. Yet, she purposefully cherry-picked 2 or 3 words and left out the other words in the statute that disproved her point. That's kind of troubling, isn't it? Then there was Justice Sotomayor, who, among other things, insisted that trade quotas against certain products were different than tariffs. Quotas and tariffs are different because, she said, tariffs are a tax and quotas are not. If you contend that tariffs are a tax because they limit supply in the face of increased demand, thereby driving up the prices of goods, and that's essentially a tax on the consumer, they argue, in violation of the power of the purse, separation of powers, Article 1. How can you then argue that quotas, which have the same purpose, that limit the import of certain goods, does not exactly the same thing for the purpose of driving up costs, helping specific industries, I assume? That's why President Reagan did it with Harley-Davidson and others. How is that not a tax to the consumer if a tariff is a tax to the consumer? How can she distinguish in that respect from a quota to a tariff? The purpose of both, based on her logic, again, is to drive up the cost of goods and effectively tax the end user. She can't have it both ways. Quotas are okay, but tariffs aren't constitutionally. Quotas don't violate separation of powers, but tariffs do. And I might add, for Justice Barrett's benefit, if the precedent you want, then you got it. Where is it? Presidents have instituted quotas throughout much of our history without congressional approval. That's a precedent. Now let's go to Justice Gorsuch. He raised the issue of delegation, or what we call the non-delegation doctrine. That is, Congress cannot delegate a core power under Article 1, the power of the purse, to another branch. In this case, the executive. Gorsuch relied mostly on hypotheticals, such as, what if a president wanted to shut down trade altogether? Can he just regulate commerce as he sees fit? Now, I'm not a big fan of these kind of arguments. But let me make a couple of points in response to Justice Gorsuch. First of all, as a practical matter, what president would shut down trade altogether? And for what purpose? Even in the world of hypotheticals, this seems utterly absurd to me. Apart from the fact that it would be political suicide for him and his party, and that every corner of the population would revolt, Congress has the power to impeach and remove a president, and let me suggest that that would happen in record time if any president did that, and both parties would participate in it. But putting aside the fanciful, where is the line drawn, he asks, in the president's power to regulate commerce? Now, that's a legitimate question. Of course, that's a question you could ask Congress. Where's their line? Or depending on how this court itself exercises power, any court, it's a question you could ask the judiciary. Where's the line? The better question, in my view, is who decides where the line is under our Constitution? That's what has to be worked out. If it's unclear, or if it involves both politically elected branches, Congress and the president, then my question is, why is the Supreme Court even involved in this point? What is it that the Supreme Court's deciding here? You have private parties and maybe states that go to the Supreme Court. So now the Supreme Court feels that it needs to intervene because you have this lower court that's ruled that what the president has done is unconstitutional. And the court's now asking questions. Where's the line? What about non-delegation? Isn't this a tax? It's different than a quota system. Court, why are you involved in this? There may be a time when you need to be involved in this, but it seems to me this is way premature. For example, Congress has taken no steps, not one step at all, to quote unquote take back its tariff power under the power of the purse. No steps. In fact, Congress as an institution isn't even involved in this litigation. Well, you might say that's because the Republicans are in charge. Good. So what? But that underscores the fact that the voters can have a say in the next election if they're upset with what the president's doing, and then they'll have their representatives who can take action if they have enough votes. You might then say, well, it's not up to the voters. We're talking about the Constitution and separation of powers. Fair enough. Interpretation of the Constitution is not based on elections. We're talking about separation of powers. Okay, so is the president. He's talking about separation of powers too. The Solicitor General argued that tariffs have multiple purposes, the most direct and important of which relate to diplomacy, international economic policy, national security. I just gave you China as an example. There are many, many, many more. As such, the power is not mostly or even primarily found in the power of the purse. It's not a direct tax, but in Article 2, under the president's power that the framers gave the President of the United States. Then the follow-up is, but every tariff on every country is not about diplomacy and international economic policy and national security, certainly not an emergency requiring immediate and unilateral presidential action. Okay, then what's the resolution of this? That 9 lawyers in black robes in the Supreme Court are going to figure this out? No, they know they can't figure that out. So what's the resolution? There's 190 countries. Every decision by a president is going to be challenged by a private party or a state in federal court. So now these lower federal courts, these federal judges, more lawyers in black robes with 2 or 3 clerks, they're going to figure it out, whether it's a national security or diplomatic issue or international economic issue. So their opinion is now going to substitute for the president and Congress. They're going to decide in each and every instance? Is that what the framers intended? They didn't even create these judges. That's absurd. Where does that wisdom and power come from? Nowhere. So my final reply to Justice Gorsuch is, if delegating unbounded tariff power to a president is dangerous, and to be clear, I don't believe that has happened here, and more to the point, I don't believe President Trump is arguing that he has unbounded power, but is complying with the law and the Constitution, then how do you explain the massive power of the bureaucracy to affect every aspect of our society through regulations, indirect taxation, and the like, a point I raised with Justice Roberts? Even reversal of the so-called Chevron decision. That goes to the issue of administrative and judicial review, not the general power of the bureaucracy to regulate anything and everything and drive up our costs through, effectively, taxation. The president has to be in a position to make these decisions, not Congress, assuming they're not shut down and out of office and the planes can't get them back to Washington, not the bureaucracy, certainly not the courts. And Congress hasn't even pushed back. Separation of powers. Justice Kavanaugh asked, following up on Justice Barrett's argument, why would a rational Congress give the president the power to essentially shut down trade? This is not about Congress giving the power to the president to shut down trade or over all trade. This is about the president exercising legitimate statutory and constitutional power with respect to dealings with other countries and their governments, and often in response to other countries and their governments relating to tariffs, national security, other economic conditions, even trade barriers that they are imposing on our citizens. How would it, as a practical matter, be handled by Congress? It can't. By the courts, it must never. So who's left? The bureaucracy? No, the president. or dressing other countries and their governments, stealing proprietary and technological information. He uses tariffs to fight that. Violating our patents. He uses tariffs to fight that. Dumping the products in our country. He uses tariffs to fight that. But if you're like Roberts, tariffs are a tax and that's it. I don't even think somebody contemplating going to law school would ask a more foolish question. So who else is in a position to gather the information, monitor the activities, who has a State Department, who has ambassadors, who has international trade advisors and so forth and so on, a massive federal government to advise him, provide him with information and so forth to make these decisions? Only the president. So to underscore, the president is not issuing a direct tax on consumers. The president is not usurping the power of the purse. The president is not shutting down trade. The president is not defying any law or legal prohibition. Congress has not taken a single step to counter the president's policies. Congress has not, by its inaction or action, delegated to the president its core functions, but neither has it delegated it to the 9 lawyers on the Supreme Court. In any event, and this is crucial in my view, the proper ruling from the Supreme Court would be as follows. Rule that there's no constitutional conflict at this point and direct that the case be dismissed at the lower court. Congress itself is not seeking judicial relief. The political branches need at least some time to work it out should there be a conflict, should an actual conflict arise. It is not the proper role of the court or any court to intervene at this point at the request of private parties or even state attorneys general. This is a political issue at this time. It could become a more constitutional issue. Even when listening to the questions from the justices, most of the questions are political and ideological in nature. To the extent they attempt to wrap them in the Constitution, they're not making any sense. And if the court intervenes, it can create havoc in the president's dealings, our country's dealings with foreign countries and governments, our national security interests respecting trade, and a whole host of issues that we cannot even contemplate, and these justices can't contemplate or even know about. Furthermore, who will make all these decisions? How is it determined who will make all these decisions? If the court rules the wrong way, in my opinion. As for Congress, well, at least the last time I checked, they can't even get a damn budget passed.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.